Good afternoon. First of all, I'd like to extend a very gracious thank you to Uta and to Christian for inviting me to this conference and to this lovely city of Vienna. It's the first time I've been out of the United States, and I'm thoroughly enjoying it. So thank you. Okay. My story is a rather long one, and I'm going to try to condense it down. So if I miss some of the details or things seem a little sketchy, feel free to ask me about them. I want to share with you my experience with HIV and AIDS and what I call going through the AIDS machine. My story started in 1995. I gave birth to my second child, my son, via a cesarean section. I was in the hospital for a few days with that, and then they sent me home. And within 24 hours, the cesarean section had become infected. I had a very high fever. It was swollen, it was red, and I started to become very ill. My husband rushed me back down to the emergency room, and they admitted me into the hospital, where they proceeded to cut the cesarean back open. By that time, the infection had gone systemic. It had gone all the way through my body, and I was very, very sick. I spent an entire month in the hospital, and they left the cesarean section open, and every day they would clean it and scrape it and repack it, and they basically let it heal from the inside out. I finally went home after a month, and at this point in time now I have a brand newborn, a new baby, and my first child, my daughter, who was 2.5 years old at the time. So I tried to start my life again, and being a young mother, I was 28 years old at the time. And as the weeks and the months went on, I never felt well again. I wasn't necessarily sick with anything. I just didn't have the energy I used to have. I didn't have the stamina to get through the day. I went back to my gynecologist, and he said, well, maybe you're just dealing with some postpartum issues, maybe some hormonal issues, wait, and it should pass. A couple months go by, and I still didn't feel any different. Now, I had a medical background. I was a paramedic, and I worked in surgery, so there was something in my brain that kept telling me something must be wrong that a doctor and a pill can fix. So I went to see another doctor, and this doctor suggested that I take some Prozac, that I might be dealing with some depression. I didn't do that. I didn't like that idea. I saw another doctor, and he told me to take a vacation. This went on for a few months. Finally, I went to a doctor. He was a hematologist, and he asked me a bunch of questions, and then he drew some lab work. He was leading me at the time to believe that I might have an issue with the liver. Maybe there was a problem with the liver. But he asked me during that visit, have you ever had an HIV test? And I said, no, I don't believe I have. And he said, well, they must have done one with one of your pregnancies. And I said, I'm not aware if they did. And he said, well, let's just do one and to cover all the bases. And I said to him, is that what you think it is? And he looked at me in the eyes and he said, not at all. White middle-class women don't get AIDS. So they drew the blood for the HIV test. And I wasn't supposed to go back for about 2 weeks, I think. It was a couple of weeks later for a follow-up visit. But his nurse called me 3 days later, and she said, you need to come back in immediately. So I called my husband at work, and we rushed back in to see this doctor. He came in, and he was shaking his head, and he was looking down, and very visibly shocked and startled he was. And he said, your HIV test came back positive. And it was one of those moments when everything slows down and everything appears to go in slow motion. We couldn't believe what we were hearing. I heard my husband crying kind of in a muffled way next to me. And then my husband said to this doctor, he said, are you sure? Could this be wrong? And he said, absolutely not. He said, we've even done the backup test, the confirmatory test. It's positive. So fast forward a little bit. I get an HIV doctor, an infectious diseases doctor, and he draws the T-cell count and the viral load. And my T-cell count was 29, my CD4 count, 29, and the viral load was 58,000. I didn't know a whole lot about HIV at that point, but he said, you've obviously been infected a very long time. We talked about the risk factors. I was a straight woman. I had never used drugs. I'd had a handful of partners that were straight. They'd never used drugs. I had one needle stick back in the late 80s, and he said, it must have come from that. Well, we didn't find out till many years later that that's virtually impossible, but he said that's where you must have gotten infected from. This was maybe end of 88 or 89, 1989, so it had been a long time. He said, you've been infected a very long time. He started me on the cocktail, and this is 1996 now. I'm sorry, it's June of 1996. And he started me on the cocktail of AZT, 3TC, and Crixivan. And he said, we will have to probably change these drugs out a lot because the virus mutates very quickly. You won't be able to stay on one drug very long. And he said, you need to get your affairs in order and make out a will. You will be lucky if you have 6 months. My husband and my children, babies, had to get tested at that point as well. My husband came back HIV negative, which we found a little bit odd because at that point in time, we had been married for 7 years and had unprotected sex the whole time. And I remember thinking, well, this is supposed to be some sexually transmitted disease. Why is he not infected? And the doctor's answer to us was, you're lucky. I wasn't aware that sexually transmitted diseases worked on luck, but apparently they do. So he was HIV negative, and my children both tested HIV negative. So we were thankful for that, and I proceeded to take this cocktail faithfully every single day without missing a dose, hardly ever. After about 4 or 5 years, I should start showing pictures. After about 4 or 5 years, my doctor told me that the Crixivan was doing damage to my liver. So he changed that out for Sustiva. And I took the AZT, 3TC, and Sustiva the entire rest of the time that I took these drugs. So in total, that was 11 years. This first picture is of me 5 months after giving birth to my first child. And that's her there. At this point, I had not had a positive HIV test. This is 1 month before testing HIV positive. This is 6 months after I've been on the drugs. And at that point in time, I had started to become very pale and anemic. I thought I was really doing very well all these years on the drugs. The things that I experienced in my mind were very minor because the other people that I knew that were on these drugs, some of them were in wheelchairs, some were on oxygen, some looked horrible. The things I experienced were things like leg cramps a lot, every night, insomnia, my hair started falling out, I would have sporadic bouts of vomiting, things like that. But in my mind, I felt pretty lucky compared to a lot of the other people that were suffering on these. When I would complain to my doctor about these side effects, he would say, that's because you have AIDS. This is all part of HIV disease. Never one time did he tell me, these are side effects of your drugs. When I first tested positive and they did the CD4 count, due to the fact that it was so low at 29, he told me you have full-blown AIDS. At that point in time, and during the entire 11 years, I was never sick with anything. I never had one opportunistic infection, but I had a full-blown AIDS diagnosis the entire time. This is 4 years into the drugs, and this was, I believe, the result of the Crixivan, the protease inhibitors. This is shortly before I decided to stop these drugs. My husband, one night in April of 2007, happened to be on the internet, and he was searching for something completely unrelated to HIV. And he came across some dissenting viewpoints, some information that we had never heard of before. I don't know how, in 11 years' time, we'd never heard of it, but it got by us. And he saw some information and he started watching some videos, and he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He was shocked, and he said to me the next morning, I found some things I think you ought to take a look at. So I proceeded to watch these videos. I ordered books. I read thousands and thousands of pages of papers and literature. And I did this for a few weeks, and by the end of April, I had changed my viewpoint, and I decided to stop all these drugs. That, again, was April of 2007. So this was taken shortly before that. I don't believe that I probably would have lived a whole lot longer on these drugs. They were starting to take a toll on me. This is what I looked like right when I stopped the drugs. I was going through a very difficult detoxification period. I stopped them all cold turkey. I didn't do anything magical or mystical. I've always just eaten a very clean, whole living foods diet. I used some natural therapies to help boost the immune system, cleanse the liver. Excuse me. But it was a difficult 3 months after I stopped those drugs. I lost a lot of weight. Everything on my body hurt. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat, and we didn't know what was happening. But one thing I did know was what I found to be true, and that I believed in that. And we just kind of wrote it out. And we waited, and I had help from a few different practitioners that I work with. I have a traditional medical doctor who also sees that there's a lot of holes in the theory that HIV kills T cells and causes AIDS. I work with a couple other practitioners that had helped me through this time. I went back to my doctor, my HIV doctor, shortly after this. It was, I think it was August of 2007. So I'd been off these drugs about 4 months at this point. I went back to my HIV doctor, and in my mind, I was going back one last time because I'd always had a good relationship with him. And I wanted to tell him what I'd done, and this was my personal decision. And so the way it worked was that I would go in 1 week ahead of time, and they would draw my blood for my CD4 and my viral load. And then a week later, I'd go to see the doctor, and by then he'd have the test results back. So my nurse called me on the phone, and she was in a panic. And she said, Karri, your lab results are completely out of whack. She said, your T-cell count has gone down to 97. It was never very high anyway. The highest my T-cell count ever got on these drugs was around 200, maybe 250. It was always very low, although I had never been sick. And she said, your viral load has gone up to 135,000. It had been undetectable the entire time I was on the drugs. So she was very upset. She said, have you stopped your drugs? And I said, yes, actually I have. And she said, are you coming in to see the doctor this week? And I said, yes, I will be in. So the day of my appointment comes, and I'm armed with all my material. And I go in, and he comes into the room, and he's angry. And he sits himself down in the chair, and he crosses his arms, and he glares at me. And I said, this is what I've chosen to do, and it's a personal decision, and I was hoping that he would respect that. And I said, have you ever seen any of this alternative information? And he said, nope. And I said, would you like to look at any of this? Would you like to know why I've made this decision? And he said, nope, with his arms crossed. And then he looked at me in the eyes, and he said, you have done a very stupid thing, and you will be dead very soon. Again, that was August of 2007. Shocking. It was a shocking statement. And I can't think of any other disease or illness ethically where a physician would look a patient in the eyes and say something like that. Anyway, I have gone back on my anniversary date of quitting these drugs the last 3 years, and they're not happy to see me. The next few pictures are taken over the last year or two. My question for people like Mr. Gallo and Mr. Fauci are, my main question would be, who's in denial? Who's in denial here when we look at some of these pictures of me on these drugs and how I used to feel and how I feel today, now that I've started to be able to rebuild my body and my system and get my life back. I'm now 44 years old. My husband and I have been married almost 20 years, and this has been part of our lives, our entire young adult lives. My children have never known a mother that has not been infected, and frankly, I had a lot of good years robbed from me. So to be called a denialist and not have answers, adequate answers to some of my questions, I find very offensive. And I think we need to spend a lot more time on conferences like this and also discuss how to help people that are truly sick and struggling with different illnesses. Because as many of you here, we're all in the same boat. We don't deny AIDS. People are immune suppressed for a variety of different reasons. But whether HIV kills T cells and causes AIDS is up for debate. I don't tell anyone what to do. I don't give out any advice. I would never tell anyone to stop their drugs. For me, it was a very personal decision. It was based on what I learned, what I believed, and it's worked for me. That's about the extent of the story. Be open to questions.